One night in November 1983, two aspiring comic book creators, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, sat at home watching television. Now, as Peter watched his television programs, Kevin was busy doodling. What he didn't realise is that he was about to doodle something that would change his life forever. Now, Kevin finished his doodle and handed the drawing over to his friend Peter. Kevin had drew a picture of a humanoid turtle standing on its hind legs, with a bandana mask over his eyes and two nunchucks strapped to his forearms. Unknown to Kevin at this time, he had just created Michelangelo. Now, Kevin told Peter that it was a Ninja Turtle. Peter instantly grabbed another piece of paper and pencil and drew his own version of Kevin's strange creation by just tweaking a few things, changing a few things here and there. Now, I think they must have known that they were onto something unique, as Kevin drew another picture, but this time he drew not one, but 4 different turtles, and a way to distinguish in between them was that he gave them all their own different set of weapons. One had nunchucks, one had 2 sais, another had a bow staff, and the last one had 2 swords. Now, when Kevin had finished his drawing, he decided to give the picture a title, and he started to write The Ninja Turtles. And Peter looked at the title and suggested that they add The Teenage Mutant in front of Ninja Turtles. And so, on that night of November 1983, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were born. Now, Peter and Kevin realised that they had just created 4 very interesting, unique, strange characters, and they also realised that they had the great base idea for a comic book, although at the same time, they had to laugh at how ridiculous the idea was. So they continued for the next few months, creating the very first Ninja Turtle comic book. Kevin and Peter used this time to try and think of an interesting story for the comic book, and trying to think up some other interesting characters for the comic book which were just as quirky and would fit into the world of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Now, when it came to the actual drawing of the comic book, Peter and Kevin both included their own work to each panel they drew, and then Peter would then go on to ink the pencil work. And eventually the comic book was finished. Now was the time to try and get it published. Now, after scraping together what money they could, which included their own savings and money borrowed from Kevin's uncle, they managed to get 3,000 copies of the comic book printed. And on May 1984, under the name Mirage Studios, which funnily enough is the business name they came up with due to the actual lack of an actual studio, because in reality their studio was actually their house. And as I said, in May 1984, the very first issue of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles hit the shelves, and Peter nor Kevin were prepared for what happened next, because the comic book was a massive, massive hit. Even though they'd only printed 3,000 copies, every single copy sold out everywhere. It was a really, really successful first comic book. Now, both Peter and Kevin were very big fans of comic book artists Jack Kirby and Frank Miller, and the book that they created was very much influenced by the artists Jack Kirby and Frank Miller. The book was also a straight-up parody of a certain blind vigilante crime fighter from the pages of Marvel Comics. Yet the Ninja Turtles had a lot in similarities to Daredevil, which I'll get into a little bit later. The book felt unique, dark and gritty and fresh, and even the actual physical book itself broke the mould, coming out at slightly a different size than most of the other comic books that were sitting on the shelf next to it. And to the customer, I suppose this made the comic book stand out from the other ones. And before we go on any further, let me just try and give you a bit of an insight into that first comic book and what the story was about. The book is coloured black and white. The art of the book is beautiful, dark, gritty as hell and violent. Now, if you grow up watching the 87 cartoon series, you might be surprised by the first issue. Because unlike the 1987 cartoon Turtles, these Turtles in the comic book, they're very different. They don't make jokes, they don't wear multicoloured headbands. It's not a very cheerful place to live in. It's, like I said, it's dark and gritty, and they're very, very violent. The story begins with the 4 turtles cornered in a dirty back alley by a violent street gang called the Purple Dragons. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because the 2003 animated series opened up the pilot episode in the exact same way. Even the dialogue came straight from the book, which had Leonardo monologuing. And we'll actually be covering the 2003 animated series a little bit later. The turtles spring into action, taking out the Purple Dragons with ease, and they're not afraid to spill blood. The police can be heard approaching in the distance, which means it's time for the turtles to disappear, so they flee down the sewer manhole and return onto their sewer lair. And this is where we meet Splinter for the very first time. Splinter goes on to congratulate them on their first fight and informs them that they are now ready for the very first mission, which is connected to the origin story, which Splinter now tells them for the very first time. Splinter sits all the turtles down and he tells the 4 turtles how he was once the pet rat of his master Hamato Yoshi, the greatest shadow warrior of the Foot Clan, which operated in Japan. Splinter then goes on to tell the turtles that whilst Hamato Yoshi practiced his martial arts, Splinter mimicked his movements from his cage. Now, I've never really liked this version of Splinter. I prefer it when Splinter was a man and gets turned into a rat, rather than him being a rat who gets turned into like a humanoid rat. Splinter's master was in a relationship with a woman named Tang Shen, but unfortunately, so was a fellow Foot Clan member named Oroko Nagi, who also wanted Tang Shen for himself and became insanely jealous. Tang Shen was not interested in Oroko Nagi, she was in love with Hamato Yoshi, and this drove Nagi crazy. Nagi visited Tang Shen when she was home alone and demanded her love, but of course, she refused. So Nagi began to beat Tang Shen for refusing his advances. At that moment, Yoshi returned home to witness the beating and got in a short fight which resulted in Yoshi beating Nagi to death. By killing another Foot Clan member, Yoshi had brought shame on the Foot Clan and was forced to flee to New York with Tang Shen and his pet rat Splinter. In New York, Yoshi opened a martial arts class, and the martial arts class prospered, and everything seemed to be going well. However, back in Japan, Nagi's brother, a 7-year-old Oroko Saki, mourned the death of his brother and he had become obsessed and wanted nothing more than to take revenge on the man who killed his brother. And being only 7 years old, he had lots of time to perfect his fighting skills, and the Foot exploited his anger and used it for their own purpose. Saki was given the task of bringing the Foot Clan over to New York when he turned 18 years of age, and Saki found this perfect for setting up his own criminal organisations and taking his revenge on Yoshi. Saki, now going by the name of the Shredder, and wore an outfit which consisted of a cape, metal helmet and face guard, with blades all over his arms and shoulders and legs, making him a lethal opponent. It didn't take long before Shredder discovered where Yoshi and Tang Shen lived. Shredder murdered Tang Shen while she was home alone, and then simply waited for Yoshi to return. Yoshi eventually arrived home to be greeted by the dead body of Tang Shen, and this is when Shredder attacked Yoshi whilst he was distracted and killed him with his blades. In the attack, Splinter's cage was knocked over and smashed, and Splinter was free, but forced to feed on the garbage in the streets and fight off stray cats. One day while Splinter searched the streets for food, he witnessed an accident. An old blind man was crossing the street and was nearly ran over by an out-of-control truck. But at the last moment, a young man leaped into the road and saved the blind man. The truck came to a sudden stop and a strange canister went flying from the truck, and it struck the young man and then bounced a few more times before colliding with a young boy who was carrying a glass bowl of baby turtles. The bowl shattered and the canister and the baby turtles all fell down the open manhole culvert into the sewers. Splinter followed and found the 4 baby turtles covered in the contents of the canister, a strange glowing ooze. Splinter gathered the turtles into an old coffee can and took them back to his burrow, himself now also covered in the ooze. Splinter started to notice that as time passed, they were all growing in size and intellect, and they all began to speak and stand up on their hind legs. And this included Splinter too, who was also mutating. Splinter decided to teach the 4 turtles the art of ninjutsu, which he had learned from his owner, Yoshi. Splinter then went on to name all of the turtles from an old book on Renaissance art that he found in a storm drain: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello and Raphael. Raphael is then sent out to deliver a message to Shredder. He infiltrates the Shredder's hideout, taking out a few thugs, then spots the Shredder in an upper window. Raphael straps the notes to one of his thighs and throws it through the window, and it buries itself into the wall. The Shredder reads the note, which challenges him to a fight on the rooftop the following night. So Shredder is given the opportunity to redeem his honour for killing Tang Shen and Yoshi, and it says in the letter that he would be fighting Splinter's 4 students. The following night, the 4 turtles meet Shredder on the rooftop, and the fight begins. They realise that Shredder is too much to face alone, and they fight him as a team. Eventually, the turtles get the better of the Shredder, and Leonardo stabs Shredder in the stomach right through. But the Shredder still lives, so Leonardo offers up his own sword, so that the Shredder may commit the act of seppuku on himself, meaning that they give the Shredder the chance to kill himself with Leonardo's sword. At that moment, the Shredder then reveals that he has a thermal detonator and he plans to kill himself and the Turtles, and he then activates the bomb. Donatello acts fast and throws his bow staff, knocking Shredder and the bomb off the roof, and Shredder explodes on the way down. The Turtles then make a pun about the Shredder being shredded, and the book ends. And yet the Shredder dies. They kill off the main antagonist in the very first issue because they didn't actually think there was going to be a second issue. Now, if any of that origin story or the characters in it felt familiar to you, let me just try and explain why. Now, Kevin and Peter pulled inspiration from different comic books, which they both enjoy to read themselves. For example, the very first issue was loosely based on the Marvel comic Daredevil. Now, first of all, you have the blind guy crossing the street, and he nearly gets hit by the truck. This has many similarities with the origin story of Daredevil, when Matt Murdock nearly gets hit by the truck. And then there's the strange canister, the chemical, which covers the Ninja Turtles. This also has similarities to Daredevil because it was the chemicals that hit Matt Murdock and made him blind. The canister did actually hit a young boy before it hit and smashed the glass ball of the baby turtles. So maybe the boy in the Ninja Turtles pilot, maybe that is Matt Murdock in some kind of weird parallel universe of comic books. Matt Murdock, Daredevil, had a master named Stick. Now the Turtles had a master named Splinter. So you see the similarities there, Stick, Splinter. And then you had the Ninja Foot Clan in the Turtles, and in Daredevil comics you had the ninja clan called the Hand. So you have the foot, you have the hand. But Daredevil wasn't the only comic book that they drew inspiration from. As I mentioned before, Frank Miller was a big inspiration. Also, especially his comic book, Ronin, as well as X-Men, Teen Titans, and another comic book called Cerebus, or Cerebus, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. This comic book featured a humanoid aardvark character. Now, as I said before, the first 3,000 copies of the comic flew off the shelves, and Peter and Kevin soon realised that they had created something very special, and they had more copies printed, which also sold out. Now, it wasn't long before they had to start thinking of creating an issue 2. The only problem was they killed off the main villain, the Shredder, right there in issue 1, because they never expected to do an issue 2. Like I said before, they never even expected this comic to take off. They weren't prepared for the success of the first book. So, issue 2 was made, and the character's personality started to form. Raphael was based loosely on Kevin's own characteristics, whilst Donatello was based loosely on Peter's. April was actually based on an old girlfriend of Kevin's. Now, it's worth mentioning that the characters that appeared in the early comics differed a little compared to what we came to know now, especially after the first animated TV show, which came later. The pre-orders for issue 2 came to 15,000 copies, and Kevin and Peter realised that they had made a profit of $4,000, $2,000 each. They realised that they could easily make a living making these comic books, but more characters were needed. Like April O'Neil, the female lab assistant of Baxter Stockman, another main character that was introduced, who was like a mad scientist. April is saved by the Turtles from Baxter's robot mouses, and they became friends. Casey Jones, who was introduced as a crazy vigilante who wore a hockey mask and carried multiple sporting goods as weapons. Now, it wasn't long before Kevin and Peter realised that they needed to expand Mirage Studios and take on some extra members of staff to help them produce the comics. And so that's just what they did. And they actually used a lot of the characteristics from the staff members and incorporated it into the characters in the comic book, just like they did with themselves, with Raphael being like Kevin and Peter being a little bit like Donatello. And so now Mirage Studios was fully up and running, and the comic book was doing really well. But it was about to explode in popularity in many different ways, which would take it so much further than being just a comic book.